Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to focus upon a country that plays a very prominent role around the world, and that's China. And also take a look at what the Chinese relationship is with many of the Gulf states. Our guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Benjamin Houghton is a postdoctoral fellow at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom, where he researches transnational repression. He holds a PhD from Durham University in the UK in government and international affairs. He is the author of China's Strategy in the Gulf, Navigating Conflicts and Rivalries, and has published 2 other books and several articles on global affairs. Dr. Benjamin Houghton, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Your timing was impeccable. China's on the rise. There's no, at least as I read about it. But how did you decide to focus on China and in that area of the world? I could see China in the South Pacific or China in Asia or whatever. But how come in the Gulf region?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Usually, when you think about China, your mind immediately goes to the South China Sea or Taiwan and how those particular issues are going to play out with Chinese neighbors and the United States. When it comes to the Persian Gulf, China has been a player for about 40 years now, to a significant degree ever since Deng Xiaoping's reforms after the death of Chairman Mao. It's a site of a number of conflicts and sadly a place where great powers find themselves needing to exert their influence and trying to extract many of the rich resources from the region as well. So it's primarily for that reason that I came to study China and the Persian Gulf, which is an area of increasing interest in the policy world and in academia, and indeed among the media and lay folk as well. So yeah, it's certainly one that's got interesting over the last few years.
It certainly has, to put it mildly, and getting more and more interesting with each passing day. Now, in your book, you reference strategic hedging. What exactly is that in relation to China and how it interacts with a variety of countries?
So strategic hedging is I argue, a 2-level strategy. First of all, it's an attempt at staying friends with everyone. So I argue that China is intent on having positive relationships with everyone in the Persian Gulf region. But there's a second dimension to it, which is that it's about making gains in the international system, but not risking conflict with the superpower, in this case, the United States. So as you can imagine, in a region like the Persian Gulf, where we've seen conflict after conflict, sadly, from the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, all the way into the dual containment of the US administrations, leading into the US invasion of Iraq, and then the very protracted Saudi-Iran or GCC-Iran rivalry. This is a region where exploring whether one actually can be friends with all, and avoiding being the enemy of anyone is actually a sustainable and achievable long-term strategy. So that's kind of the basis of the book. Yeah, so that's strategic hedging in a nutshell.
Mhm. Now, several years ago, China launched the Belt and Road Project, which was really probably one of the largest uh, economic development programs in the world, I would imagine. They invested billions of dollars, but a large part of that went to Africa and to some of the other countries. Did any of it go into the Gulf region? And if it did it create hostilities or rivalries or some type of conflict?
In many respects, so first of all, it very much has gone to the Gulf region. Indeed, there have been approximately 140 and increasing BRI projects in the region, which is more than even neighboring Central Asia. So you can imagine that there is a lot of interest there. In many respects, their economies in the Persian Gulf are still growing and they have a great deal of resources. And the very nature of the Belt and Road Initiative is that there's, in many respects, no need for states to actually compete for every single project, because the nature of it is an attempt at having that perfect horizontal road, as it were, or grouping of routes. So yeah, there's been a lot of interest there. China's exports to the region continue to rise, and its interest in construction and infrastructure building, not to mention joint energy ventures, continues to be something that's rising. So yeah, there's been a great deal of interest for certain.
Mhm. Now, all countries have rivalries with other countries. It seems like everybody, to some degree. I mean, it depends upon how far we take it to the nth degree or not. But
Mm.
anyway, does China have rivalries in the Gulf region? that they have to navigate in order to be successful or to not get into a conflict or get in some type of arrangement where they're competing against one another?
Yeah, so when it comes to China's own rivalries in the region, the core question is that of the United States and whether or not the two are actually destined for some type of war, which could include or could indeed center around the Persian Gulf. It's my estimation and the estimation of a number of my colleagues that there is no reason to be concerned about any kind of imminent war that features the Persian Gulf between these two superpowers. The primary reason for that is A, China's reaching power. It actually doesn't have the reach to have any kind of military conflict in that type of locale. But also, China's incredibly reliant on US security architecture in the region. Its focus has been heavily economic, and it's been enjoying the protections that have been provided by the United States. I would say that with one caveat, though, which is that increasingly China's soft power in the region is enabling it to avoid attracting the ire of regional actors. So one example of this was China managing to get special arrangements with the Houthis when they were attacking maritime vessels. And although one Chinese vessel was attacked, broadly speaking, they managed to get through the issue without needing any type of US security architecture. So that's the primary reason why I wouldn't be too concerned about Chinese US competition, though there are lots of facets to that, of course, especially on the broader scale. Um, it's certainly in the case of my research, it's more the rivalries that exist within the region that China's had to be so careful to avoid, and in particular with its relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran, avoiding the frustration, anger of the GCC states and indeed the United States has been a significant challenge that it's had to navigate for many decades now.
Most assuredly, yes. You mentioned Iran, and that is a country where the U.S. and many other countries have had problems with in the past, and vice versa. They've had problems
Mm,
with us. It's a two-way street. But
mm.
how has the Chinese-Iranian relationship developed, and what is the status of it today?
So China has had relations with Iran in one way or another since the early 70s when the Shah was in power. There was a brief hiatus and a moment of challenge following the revolution, but Beijing did everything it could, excuse me, to quickly get things back on track. It's been a relationship that's been subject to a high level of scrutiny from the West ever since the Deng Xiaoping reforms and the renewed focus on Iran. So as early as the Iran-Iraq War, China was supplying both sides with silkworm missiles. Now, these silkworm missiles were the subject of a great deal of scrutiny and attracted a significant amount of pressure from the United States at the time. And ever since then, the relationship has still been the subject of scrutiny, not least of all because China supported Iran originally with its nuclear development. And ever since it has been part of the sanctions regime against Iran as part of the United Nations, China has been doing all that it can to circumvent these sanctions and support Iran's economy, leading to a tricky situation where essentially China has been able to monopolize Iranian markets while also being partially in charge of keeping Iran marginalized. That picture became more complicated after Trump withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, because of course China can simply claim that it was never its idea to cease the deal, and therefore it's created a little bit more wiggle room. But even to this day, there's a great deal of scrutiny from the United States, and there are ongoing sanctions against Chinese companies for trying to circumvent sanctions with Iran to continue oil trade. So one of the biggest known secrets is continued Iranian oil supplies to China using any number of surreptitious techniques, including transshipments via the likes of the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, the list goes on, and even swapping oil in ships owned by different countries at sea. So it's estimated that Iran is still supplying China with anything up to 1 million barrels per day of oil, which is a decent amount. And yeah, so basically the relationship continues to be highly controversial, but nonetheless, perhaps subject to a little too much scrutiny to warrant that it warrants.
It's amazing how many methods or techniques there are to avoid sanctions and to get around impediments, shall we say, from one country to another. And the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese, they have been masters at it to some degree. As a lot of foreign policy analysts have commented that the Chinese really utilize soft power much better than America does, or a lot of countries. And what we saw just recently with the U.S. dismantling the USAID program, that was one of
Mhm.
our main methods of soft power into Africa and to many other areas of the world to help millions of people. And we
Mhm.
basically just unilaterally gave it up and walked away from it. But the Chinese do not do that. And you mentioned the United Nations. I remember every incident that I can recall over several decades. Anytime the United States pulls back at the United Nations, the Chinese fill that void. They run
Mhm.
right into it. We saw it with the world withdrawal of the World Health Organization. We saw it with the U.S. pulling, well, just any place when it cuts its funding. China, in many cases, will raise its funding. How do they
Mhm.
use? How is it they're? I will. Well, yeah, I will. It appears they're a little smarter about soft power than we are.
Possibly, they've kind of approached the region much like many other regions with a different mentality, which is that they don't need to be the foremost military power in order to extract benefits. So that's certainly one aspect of the relationship. Another is that in an authoritarian country, it is easier to mobilize resources from across the state and sometimes from across society in service of these broader goals. So that can make it easier to have a project such as the Belt and Road Initiative, whereby you can have a win-win version of aid that can support the recipient whilst also bolstering your own economy. So that's probably part of the picture in all of that. And as you rightly say, China's tried to step in certain mediation initiatives as well. It was involved in the Beijing Declaration, which was negotiations between Hamas and Fatah in Palestine to try and get them on the same page. And similarly, it dealt with the Saudi-Iran normalization a couple of years ago. So yeah, it's certainly the case that Beijing's eager to fill a void. Question marks always are raised at this point, though, as to whether China can actually underwrite any type of agreement or deal if it doesn't have any type of military wherewithal in a location, or indeed the remotest of desires to use the military to underwrite something, then can it actually be the one to guarantee arrangements? Now, in the case of Saudi-Iran normalization, the argument is win-win-win. So China can sit back and say, if you want to continue extracting benefits as a collective, and you want the likes of the Belt and Road Initiative to succeed, well, then it would help for that to have a nice continuous flow. But yeah, it varies from case to case, of course.
There are many ways to utilize soft power, and
Mm.
they've really turned it into a master class in many respects. And we're going to come back in just a moment and talk about that. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you have a podcast, or you're with an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a really interesting situation, and that is how the Chinese are dealing with many of the Gulf states. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Benjamin Houghton is a postdoctoral fellow at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. His most recent book is China's Strategy in the Gulf, Navigating Conflicts and Rivalries. Benjamin, we're talking about the how China's negotiating and working, and a lot of this they do behind the scenes. They're just not flashy about it. We some of the European countries, America, we sometimes get a little flashier than maybe we should. But anyway, that's a thought for another day. But I'm just curious, how will the Chinese move forward, since they are, according to a large number of foreign policy analysts, they're rapidly, I'm not going to say the number one country in the world, but with uh, so many people are questioning what we're doing to our own country, and destabilizing our alliances with European countries, talking about taking over Greenland, Panama Canal, different things like that, that the Chinese are just quietly laying low and their prestige seems to be going up. It's not, it doesn't seem to be dropping. Now, I'm sure that there are some countries that may not agree with that statement that I just made, but how do you see them moving forward, not only in the Gulf region, but also in other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, there's certainly something to be said for a low profile, not least of all because there are so many middle powers around the world that feel that they are now capable of expressing their needs on the international stage. And so a partner that doesn't request or pressure them to achieve particular things on a domestic level, to cease particular activities, for example, human rights violations, a country like that is capable of attracting a significant amount of support. And that's inevitably part of China's strategy in approaching large swathes of the world. Where China goes from here is a challenging one. There are always questions over whether or not Beijing will choose to invade Taiwan or how it's going to try and go about reunification. Certainly, Xi Jinping seems fairly set on that as a process, and I dare say there has been an element of keeping an eye on what's going on in Ukraine to see about lessons that can be learned in that regard. That's of course speculation. We never know for certain if that's going to happen, but that will probably be one of the big turning points in identifying how China will go about that next phase. But for now, it's that again that win-win cooperation, emphasis on the five principles of peaceful coexistence, which is all about not interfering in each other's sovereignty and domestic affairs. That's facilitating a great deal of rapprochement between China and states all over. Of course, on the flip side, the Western states are all too used to a high level of Chinese intrusion, which of course is complete flies in the face of the so-called non-interference, dealing with a whole host of grey zone strategies to try and undermine democracy and the safety of citizens. So it's a complex picture as always.
It certainly is, no doubt about it. Well, we've seen that President Donald Trump just completed a trip to the Gulf states,
Hmm.
to large, well, several areas in the Middle East. What do you think will come out of this? How do you think that the relationship between the U.S. and our allies and the Gulf states will be the same, or will it change? Or what? It's a little too early to tell right now, but how do you see this shaking out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating one. For several years, the dynamics have been shifting enormously as the Gulf states have been attempting to exert greater influence on the international stage. Even with the Saudi murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi a few years ago, a stronger American response than that which came from the likes of Russia and China immediately reinforced that notion that authoritarian solidarity was present in their relationships. Similarly, these states have been trying to show to the US that they've got more independence than they previously have had. Part of that equation is that they've managed to amass very impressive economies, increasingly outpacing the Western states, which is giving them the comfort and sense of self to proceed in the ways that they wish to. So as it goes from his trip, there have been a couple of interesting things that have happened. The trip is still ongoing, so apologies to your viewers if anything changes between me speaking now and when they actually see this, as indeed it has a habit of doing with the current president of the United States anyway over the course of a few hours sometimes, sadly. So one of the things is that he's managed to attract a significant, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into the United States economy from Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and from Qatar. And similarly, he's been able to secure a deal with the Saudis that they'll purchase something in the range of, I think, $130 billion worth of weaponry and military equipment. So that's first of all a big step, and that's a chance that he's had to reinforce America's predominance as the military supplier to the region. It is still the preference of regional states that they receive these things from America and not from the likes of China. So that's helpful. But one particularly interesting thing is that Donald Trump has just rescinded the AI diffusion rule, which is enabling US companies to sell semiconductors to regional states. Now, President Biden introduced the rules to stop this trade from happening because of fears that they would share the technology with China. And indeed, his administration was pressuring regional states significantly to try and stop them engaging on artificial intelligence and new technologies with China. So this particular move will likely bolster the US position in the region, as they'll use it to exert greater influence and say, you don't need to work with the Chinese on AI and on semiconductors, work with us instead. So that's a big thing. And then if you'll forgive me a final point on the matter, because this is huge news, Donald Trump removing the sanctions on Syria is going to have very profound implications. The gut reaction for me would have been that this wouldn't affect China hugely because surely this new regime hates China for how it supported Assad, but it doesn't appear to be the case because they've had 3 delegations of Chinese visit them. So with the removal of sanctions, it's likely that the ever-hungry Chinese with their Belt and Road Initiative and their desires for reconstruction will likely be able to swoop in and benefit from that equation as well, which hopefully will benefit the Syrian people who've suffered for far too long. But that's another important arena to keep an eye on.
Mhm. Yes, and as you mentioned, these deals can change literally minute to minute. What we're talking about today, tomorrow may not even be applicable, but we'll see how that goes. Well, very briefly, let me ask you, there has been a lot of tension between China and the United States. And the way I look at it, and a lot of foreign policy people do, last thing we need is some type of a conflict between these powers or between any powers, come right down to it, especially nuclear powers. But what would you recommend? What does your book recommend as to how the Chinese, the Gulf state countries, the US, the Europeans, and a large part of the world can work towards really complementary peace and development, and to move away from sword, saber rattling and that type of thing?
It's certainly the question of the century, and indeed has been the question of centuries before this one as well. When it comes to the Persian Gulf, I think the key thing is ensuring that there is a nuclear deal with Iran as soon as possible. While there is an appetite in the Arab neighbors for such a deal, it's a exceptional timing to actually make that happen and to try to reduce conflict. It goes without saying that, well, it should go without saying that a direct conflict with Iran would be cataclysmic for realistically all of the great powers and of course the region. So that would be the first port of call. The second is to reinforce the areas of cooperation that are simple for them to work on. So the Red Sea, they've worked on anti-piracy for a great number of years and down in the Indian Ocean. So continuing to work on areas where it's easy to cooperate and easy to agree is always important. And then just keeping that dialogue open. It's unfortunate that it's such an old notion and so recycled, but it's recycled for a reason, which is simply that dialogue facilitates understanding. And we can only hope that that's what starts to take place between China and the US in particular, and that they can overcome some of their current issues with one another.
Mm-hmm. And dialogue and diplomacy can be very boring and can take time. But as I think it was Winston Churchill, Sir Winston said, better to jaw than war. And that's the last thing we need, that's for sure. Well, let me ask you, what do you see in the last 30 seconds we have as our biggest challenge as we move forward with this relationship among really China, the Gulf states, and with the Western countries?
For me, it moves away from the strategic for a moment and it focuses on this authoritarian solidarity that's emerging. I think for the minorities of the world that are being repressed by their own governments, it can be particularly challenging if they have nowhere to escape. If all of the countries that they go to support the home governments in oppressing them both within their borders and outside of their borders. So that's one of the primary issues from my perspective. And then from a strategic perspective, is that can lead to a stronger rapprochement between the likes of China and the likes of the Gulf states, which can increasingly marginalize the Western liberal countries, which is a challenge. If diplomacy then becomes more of an issue, then that can lead to greater human rights violations and more marginalization of those peoples.
Well, Dr. Benjamin Houghton, you've written an excellent book, very timely, and it's one that I'm sure that many of the policymakers around the world will be using and thumbing through it and that type of thing, because you have a lot of good information in there. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you ever so much, Bill. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.